The locomotive exhaled a final, shuddering breath of steam that washed over the wooden planks of the Oakhaven station. Dust swirled in the heavy afternoon air. Alara stepped down from the iron steps. Her dark skirt dragged slightly against the rough timber of the platform. She held a single, battered leather valise in her left hand. It contained everything she owned in the world. It was not much. She was 28 years old, a woman deemed too plain, too quiet, and too stubborn for the polite parlors of the East. Her uncle had made that clear the day he sold her father's estate and handed her a train ticket. She was to marry a Mr. Arthur Hughes, a town merchant who had advertised for a docile, obedient bride. Alara had agreed because starvation was a poor alternative to a loveless arrangement. She stood on the platform and searched the faces of the few men waiting in the shadow of the station overhang. She looked for a soft, aging merchant in a tailored suit. Instead, a man stepped out of the shadows. He did not wear a suit. He wore denim faded white at the knees and a canvas coat that smelled of horses and dry earth. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by a harsh sun. His face was a landscape of hard lines and quiet endurance. His eyes were the color of slate. He stopped 2 paces from her. He did not smile. He looked at her with an assessing, penetrating gaze that made her spine stiffen. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair marked with early silver at the temples. "Miss Alara Vance," he said. His voice was rough, like dry wood scraping against stone. Alara did not retreat. She lifted her chin. "You are the wrong man," she said. She spoke the words firmly before he could even offer his name. She knew what a merchant looked like, and this man was a creature of the open prairie, a man forged in labor and silence. He did not flinch. He did not argue. He looked down at her battered valise, then back up to her eyes. "Arthur Hughes caught the cholera 3 weeks ago," the man said. Alara felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her boots. He passed on. The man continued. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant whistle of the departing train. "I see," Alara said softly. She was entirely alone. She had no money for a return ticket. She had no home to return to. The man reached out and took the heavy handle of her valise. His hand was calloused, the knuckles scarred. "My name is Silas," he said. He looked out toward the horizon, where the prairie met the sky in a haze of heat. "I have a ranch 10 miles out. I have 2 children who are wild as coyotes and a house that is falling to sorrow." He looked back at her. "I need a mother for my children, and you need a roof." Alara stared at him. "I am not a piece of livestock to be traded to the next available buyer, Mr. Silas." Silas did not blink. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of a man. "Give me a week," he said. The request was quiet. It was not a plea. It was a practical proposition, stripped of all sentiment and pretense. "1 week," he repeated. "If you find the arrangement intolerable by Sunday next, I will pay your passage back east, or to wherever you wish to go. You have my word." Alara looked into his slate eyes. She saw no cruelty there. She saw only a vast, echoing emptiness. It was an emptiness she recognized from her own reflection in the mirror after her father died. "I will not be a servant," Alara said. Her voice was steady. "I will not be a silent shadow in your house. If I stay as a partner in the labor." Silas nodded slowly. "A partner," he agreed. He turned and walked toward a heavy wooden wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses. Alara followed him into the dust. The journey to the ranch was measured in long, unbroken miles of silence. Silas sat on the wooden bench, his hands light on the reins. He watched the trail ahead with a vigilance that suggested he was used to watching for danger. Ilara sat beside him, her back straight, refusing to lean against the wooden seat. She watched the landscape. It was a harsh, unforgiving country. The grass was pale and dry, waving like a restless ocean under the wind. There were no trees, only endless stretches of sky and earth. Inside his mind, Silas calculated the risk he had just taken. He had come to town for supplies and heard the station master talking about the bride arriving for a dead man. Silas had not planned to take a wife. The memory of his late wife, Clara, was a locked room in his chest that he refused to open. But his children, Thomas and Sarah, were slipping away from him. They were running wild, their clothes torn, their eyes full of a grief they did not know how to speak. Silas could break a wild horse, he could build a barn from nothing, but he could not mend a broken child. He had looked at Ilara on the platform and seen a woman who did not break easily. He had seen the way she held her valise, like a shield. He had heard the iron in her voice. She was plain, her features sharp and tired, her dress devoid of lace or ribbon. But she possessed a quiet dignity that commanded the space around her. He hoped it would be enough. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, when the wagon finally crested a low ridge. Below them sat the ranch. It was a sprawling collection of structures. A large, sturdy house, built of thick timber, stood at the center. A massive barn sat to the west, flanked by corrals. It was an impressive domain, built by a man of undeniable capability. But as they drew closer, Ilara saw the signs of neglect. The porch steps were splintered. A shutter hung crooked on a window. The flower beds near the front door were choked with dead weeds. It was a place that had lost its soul. Silas pulled the horses to a halt. He secured the reins and stepped down, coming around to offer Ilara his hand. She looked at his large, rough palm. She placed her gloved hand in his and stepped down. His grip was firm but surprisingly gentle. The moment her boots touched the ground, a blur of motion caught her eye. From around the corner of the house, two figures appeared. They stopped dead in their tracks at the sight of the wagon. It was a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl of 7. Their clothes were covered in dust. The boy held a wooden stick like a sword. The girl hid half behind her brother, her hair a tangled bird's nest of dark curls. They stared at Ilara with open, unmasked hostility. Silas sighed, a low sound in his chest. "Thomas, Sarah," he called out, "come here." The children did not move. Thomas tightened his grip on the stick. "Who is she?" the boy demanded. His voice was sharp, defensive. "This is Miss Ilara," Silas said. "She will be staying with us." "We do not want her," Sarah said loudly from behind her brother. Silas took a step forward, his jaw tightening. Ilara put a hand out, stopping him. Silas looked at her, surprised by the sudden gesture. Ilara did not look at him. She walked slowly toward the children. She did not smile a false, clawing smile. She stopped a few feet away and looked at them with serious, respectful eyes. "I am not entirely sure I want to be here either," Ilara said. The honesty of the statement caught the children off guard. Thomas lowered his stick a fraction of an inch. "But," Ilara continued, "it seems we are all stuck with one another for at least a week. I would appreciate it if we could manage a truce." She held out her hand to the boy. Thomas stared at it. He looked at his father, then back at Ilara. He did not take her hand, but he dropped the stick. "I am hungry," the boy announced, turning his back and walking into the house. Sarah followed him, darting a final, suspicious glance at Ilara. Ilara lowered her hand. She took a deep breath. Silas stepped up beside her. "They are not usually this bold," he murmured. "They are frightened," Elara replied simply. "Fear makes soldiers of us all." Silas looked at her profile in the fading light. He realized she saw right through the children's anger to the wound beneath. He picked up her valise and led her inside. The interior of the house was spacious, but shadowed. The air was stale. Dust coated the heavy oak tables and the stone hearth. There were no feminine touches, no embroidered pillows, no pictures on the walls. It was a barracks, not a home. Silas showed her to a small room off the kitchen. It was the storage room, he said, setting her bag on the narrow cot. "I cleared it out. It will serve perfectly," Elara said. She did not complain about the small window or the bare floorboards. She removed her hat and her gloves. "Where is the flour?" she asked. Silas blinked. "In the pantry." "Why?" "The boy said he was hungry," Elara said, rolling up her sleeves. "I have exactly 1 week to prove my use, Mr. Silas. I suggest you point me toward the stove." For the first time, a shadow of a smile touched Silas's mouth. It was gone before it truly formed. He pointed to the pantry. The first 3 days were a war of silent attrition. Elara woke before dawn every morning. She scrubbed the floors until her knees bruised. She baked bread that filled the hollow house with the scent of yeast and warmth. She mended the torn shirts she found in the laundry pile. The children actively resisted her. Thomas would track mud across her freshly washed floors. Sarah would refuse to eat the food Elara placed before her. Through it all, Elara did not raise her voice. She did not scold. When Thomas tracked mud, she simply handed him a mop and a bucket. She did not yell, she just waited until he cleaned it up. When Sarah refused to eat, Elara quietly removed the plate and saved it for later, offering no alternative. Silas watched this from a distance. He was a man of the fields, spending his days mending fences and tending cattle. But he found himself returning to the house earlier than usual. He noticed the way the house smelled of lavender soap. He noticed the way the fire was always banked perfectly in the hearth. Most of all, he noticed Elara. He noticed the elegant line of her neck as she bent over the washboard. He noticed the quiet strength in her hands. On the 4th evening, the silence broke. A violent thunderstorm swept across the prairie. The wind howled like a legion of the damned, rattling the window panes. Lightning flashed, illuminating the house in stark blue-white relief. Thunder shook the floorboards. Silas was in the barn, securing the heavy doors, when the worst of the storm hit. Inside the house, Elara sat by the hearth, mending a sock. A massive crack of thunder shattered the air. A scream echoed from the loft where the children slept. Elara dropped her sewing and ran up the narrow stairs. She found Sarah huddled in the corner of her bed, her hands clamped over her ears, sobbing hysterically. Thomas was sitting on the edge of his bed, trying to look brave, but his hands were shaking. Elara did not hesitate. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of Sarah's bed. She did not try to pull the girl's hands away. She simply began to sing. It was an old Celtic lullaby her grandmother had taught her, a song of deep waters and quiet shores. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady. It cut through the roar of the wind. Slowly, Sarah's sobs quieted. The little girl peeked through her fingers. Elara kept singing, her eyes fixed softly on the child. She reached out and gently smoothed the tangled curls from Sarah's forehead. Sarah did not pull away. After a moment, Sarah crawled across the mattress and pressed her small body against Elara's side. Elara wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. She looked over at Thomas. She patted the empty space on the bed beside her. Thomas hesitated. Another crack of thunder decided for him. He scrambled across the room and sat beside Elara, leaning his head against her shoulder. Elara held them both, her voice weaving a protective shield against the storm. Downstairs, the front door opened. Silas stepped inside, dripping wet, the wind howling behind him as he shoved the door shut. He heard the singing. He walked silently to the base of the stairs and looked up. He saw Elara holding his children. He saw the terror leaving their faces, replaced by a fragile peace. Silas felt a hard, cold knot in his chest begin to loosen. It was a knot he had carried for 2 years. He realized, in that moment, that he did not just want Elara to stay. He needed her to stay. He backed away silently, leaving them to the comfort of the song. The next morning, Elara found a small, beautifully carved wooden comb on the kitchen table. It lay exactly where she usually sat to drink her morning tea. The wood was polished smooth, the teeth perfectly spaced. She picked it up. It felt warm in her hand. She looked out the window and saw Silas walking toward the barn, his broad back to the house. She touched the comb to her cheek. A faint blush rose to her skin. It was the first gift she had received in years. She did not thank him aloud. Instead, when he returned for the midday meal, he found a cup of hot, sweetened coffee waiting exactly where he usually sat, alongside a thick slice of fresh pie. He looked at the coffee. He looked at Elara, who was busy wiping down the counter, her back to him. Silas sat down and drank the coffee. It tasted like home. The week was drawing to a close. It was Saturday, the day before her deadline. The fragile peace of the house was shattered by the arrival of a carriage. It was a polished, expensive vehicle that had no business on a dusty ranch road. Elara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Silas emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in his hand. The carriage stopped, and a woman stepped out. She was dressed in fine, dark silk, a parasol shielding her face from the sun. She was Silas's sister-in-law, Martha, the sister of his late wife. Martha lived in the town of Okevan and considered herself the arbiter of all social propriety. She had never approved of Silas, and she certainly did not approve of his current arrangement. Silas, Martha said, her voice carrying across the yard like a sharp bell. Silas planted the pitchfork in the dirt. "Martha," he replied, "to what do I owe the visit?" Martha closed her parasol with a snap. She turned her sharp, critical eyes on Elara. She looked Elara up and down, taking in the plain cotton dress, the flower on the apron, the loose strands of hair. "I came to see the truth of the scandalous rumors running through town," Martha declared. She marched toward the porch. "They say you have taken in a stray woman, a mail-order bride meant for a dead man." Silas's jaw tightened. "Elara is a guest in my home," he said coldly. Martha let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "A guest?" "She is a beggar, Silas, a cast-off from the East who couldn't secure a proper husband." Elara felt the words like physical blows. They were the same words her uncle had used. She stood perfectly still, refusing to let Martha see her bleed. "You cannot keep her here," Martha continued, pointing a gloved finger at Elara. "It is an insult to my sister's memory. The whole town is speaking of your disgrace." Silas took a step forward, his anger rising like a dark tide. Before he could speak, a shout rang out from the pasture behind the house. It was Thomas. Silas spun around. Smoke was rising from the dry grass near the edge of the far fencing. A spark from a passing train, or perhaps a careless traveler, had caught the brittle prairie grass. The wind was picking up, pushing the flames directly toward the wooden cattle pens where the new calves were kept. "Fire!" Silas yelled. He dropped the pitchfork and ran. Elara did not hesitate. No, She abandoned the porch, ignoring Martha's startled gasp, and sprinted toward the well. She grabbed 2 heavy iron buckets and began to pump water with frantic, desperate strength. Silas reached the pins. The fire was moving fast, a crackling wall of orange and black. He tore off his coat and began beating at the flames, trying to break the line. The calves were bleating in terror, pressing against the wooden rails. Elara arrived, hauling the heavy, sloshing buckets. She threw the water onto the burning grass near the fence line, choking on the thick, acrid smoke. "Get back!" Silas roared at her over the roar of the fire. No. Elara shouted back. She dropped the empty buckets and grabbed a heavy burlap sack from the fence. She dunked it in the remaining mud puddle near the trough and joined Silas on the fire line. They fought the flames side by side. The heat was searing, blistering Elara's face and hands. Smoke burned her eyes, blinding her. But she did not retreat. She swung the wet burlap with rhythmic, relentless fury, beating the fire back from the wood. Thomas and Sarah ran up, carrying smaller buckets of dirt. "Throw it on the edges," Elara commanded, her voice ringing with authority. The children obeyed instantly, working as a team. For 20 minutes, the world was nothing but heat, smoke, and desperate labor. Finally, the wind shifted, blowing the flames back over the burned earth. Deprived of fuel, the fire began to die. Silas stomped out the last of the embers. He stood leaning against the fence, chest heaving, his face blackened with soot. He looked over at Elara. She was sitting in the dirt. Her dress was scorched at the hem. Her hands were blistered and bleeding. She was breathing hard, wiping sweat and soot from her forehead with a trembling arm. Thomas and Sarah were huddled next to her, safe and unhurt. Silas felt a profound, overwhelming surge of emotion crash through him. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had arrived with nothing but a valice and a core of unbreakable iron. She had fought for his land. She had fought for his children. She had fought for him. Martha was standing near the house, holding a handkerchief over her nose, staring in horror at the scene. She had not lifted a finger to help. Silas walked over to Elara. He knelt in the dirt beside her. He ignored the children, ignored his sister-in-law, ignored the whole world. He reached out and gently took Elara's blistered hands in his own. His touch was incredibly light. "You are hurt," he said softly. "I will be fine," Elara whispered, looking down at their joined hands. Silas looked up into her eyes. "You did not run." "I told you," Elara said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "I am a partner in the labor." Silas stood up. He did not let go of her hand. He pulled her gently to her feet. He turned to face Martha, who was marching toward them, her face flushed with indignation. "Look at this mess." Martha shrilled. "Look at her. She is a wild woman, Silas. She is not fit to be in polite society." Silas released Elara's hand. He stepped between Elara and Martha. He seemed to grow taller, his presence expanding to fill the yard. "Martha," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly, absolute authority. "You will not speak of her that way." Martha gaped at him. "Silas, I am only thinking of your reputation." "The town, I do not care about the town," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He looked Martha dead in the eye. "The town did not come to put out my fire. The town did not comfort my children when they wept in the night. The town did not bring warmth back to this dead house." He gestured toward Elara. "This woman stood in the fire for my family." He stepped closer to Martha, forcing the woman to take a step back. "She is not a stray. She is not a beggar." Silas turned his head slightly, looking back at Elara. His slate eyes were entirely open, entirely vulnerable. "She is the bravest woman I have ever known, and if she will have me, she is going to be my wife." Alara's breath caught in her throat. She stared at his broad back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Martha was speechless. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then turned on her heel. She marched back to her carriage, climbed inside, and ordered the driver away. The carriage rolled off in a cloud of dust, leaving silence in its wake. The children stood watching, wide-eyed. Silas turned slowly to face Alara. The adrenaline of the fire was fading, leaving only the raw, exposed truth between them. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Silas said quietly. Alara nodded slowly. "The week is up," she murmured. Silas took a step toward her. "I told you I would buy your ticket back east if you found the arrangement intolerable." He stopped inches from her. The smell of smoke and sweat hung between them, a testament to their shared survival. "Is it intolerable, Alara?" he asked. His voice was rough, trembling slightly with a fear he had not felt in years, the fear of losing something precious. Alara looked up into his soot-stained face. She saw the honorable, guarded man who had offered her shelter. She saw the father who worried for his children. She saw the partner who had fought the flames beside her. She lifted her bandaged, aching hands and placed them gently on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong and steady beneath the heavy canvas of his shirt. "I have no desire to go back east," Alara said. A profound relief washed over Silas's face. He reached up and framed her face with his large, rough hands. He did not care about the soot on her cheeks. He did not care that she was plain by the standards of foolish men. To him, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He leaned down. He kissed her. It was not a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of deep, mutual recognition. It was the sealing of a bond forged in fire and silent understanding. Alara closed her eyes and leaned into his strength, feeling entirely, finally, at home. When they parted, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "We will go to town on Monday," he whispered. "We will make it legal. We will make it right." Alara smiled, a true, radiant smile that transformed her face. "Monday will be fine," she said. Behind them, Thomas and Sarah cheered softly. The quiet aftermath of the crisis settled over the ranch like a soothing balm. That evening, they sat in the kitchen. Silas carefully cleaned and bandaged Alara's burned hands. His touch was meticulous, his brow furrowed in concentration. He applied a cooling salve that smelled of mint and earth. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice low. "Only a little," Alara lied. She did not mind the pain. The pain was a reminder that she was alive, that she belonged here. Monday morning dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, unblemished blue. They rode into Oak Haven in the wagon. The town was bustling with the start of the week's trade. Whispers followed them as they walked down the wooden boardwalks. Eyes peered from behind store windows. The town gossips were out in force, fueled by Martha's venomous tales. Silas ignored them all. He walked with his head held high, Alara's hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. They walked directly to the magistrate's office. The ceremony was brief. It was devoid of lace, flowers, or music. But as Silas slid a simple gold band onto Alara's finger, the air in the small room felt sacred. "With this ring, I thee wed," Silas said, his voice echoing with absolute conviction. He looked into her eyes, and the promise was absolute. When they stepped back out onto the boardwalk, a small crowd had gathered. Martha stood at the front, her mouth pinched in a tight line of disapproval. Silas stopped. He did not shy away. He looked over the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the merchants, the ranchers, the gossips. "Let it be known," Silas said, his voice carrying down the street clear and commanding. "This is Elara Vance. She is now Elara, my wife." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "She is the mistress of my home and the mother of my children. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me, and I will not tolerate it." He did not yell. He did not threaten. He simply stated a law of nature. The crowd fell silent. A few of the older ranchers, men who knew the harsh reality of prairie life, nodded in slow respect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Martha turned and hurried away, her power broken. Silas looked down at Elara. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his slate eyes. "Let us go home," he said. "Yes," Elara agreed. "Let's." A year passed. The ranch transformed under the combined strength of their partnership. The broken shutters were repaired. The flower beds bloomed with vibrant, resilient wildflowers Elara had transplanted from the prairie. The house was no longer a barren barracks, but a home filled with light and the smell of baking bread. The children, Thomas and Sarah, had shed their feral hostility. They laughed loudly, ran freely, and clung to Elara with a fierce, protective loyalty. Thomas learned to carve wood from his father, and Sarah learned to read by the hearth fire with her mother. It was a quiet evening in late autumn. The harvest was in, and the air held the crisp promise of winter. Elara sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was heavily pregnant, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. The child inside her kicked, a strong, rhythmic flutter of new life. Silas walked up the steps, dusting the hay from his coat. He stood behind her chair. He placed his large, warm hands on her shoulders, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of her head. "The horses are bedded down," he murmured. "The children are asleep," Elara replied softly. They looked out over the darkened prairie. The stars were emerging, a brilliant, endless canopy of silver light. There was no need for words. The silence between them was no longer an empty void of grief or fear. It was a rich, comforting silence, built on trust, respect, and a love that had proven itself in the fire. Elara reached up and placed her hand over his. She remembered the day she had stepped off the train, terrified and alone. She remembered telling him he was the wrong man. She smiled into the darkness. He had picked up her bags. He had asked for a week. And in that week, he had given her a lifetime. Silas squeezed her shoulder gently. He looked down at the woman who had saved his home, his children, and his heart. He knew he was a man blessed beyond measure. The wind moved through the dry grass like breath through an old flute. They sat together in the quiet night, two resilient souls who had found their exact right place in the world. The frontier was harsh. The winter would be cold. But inside their home, the fire would never go out.